Following is an AZPM original production.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of the Press Room from the radio studios of AZPM. I'm your host, Steve Goldstein. Number of stories to discuss this week, some very environmental and some from the environment of a courtroom. We'll get into more details on that in just a moment. But first, let me introduce our panelists for this week. John Washington of AZ Luminaria, Sarah Lapidus of Report for America and the Arizona Republic, Katya Mendoza of AZPM, and Paul Ingram of the Tucson Sentinel. Welcome back, all of you. Thanks for being here. Paul, let's start off with the latest on this trial related to the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Old friend, former Sergeant Sheriff Chris Nanos. I'm going to call him Ricky Garcia because everyone seems to, but Ricardo Garcia. It's in the hands of the jury as of Friday morning as we're talking. What are some things that are really standing out about this case, and how much upheaval could it potentially cause for the sheriff's office, even with Sheriff Nanos winning re-election?
Well, I mean, it comes down to, it's a sexual assault case. There are some of the commanders who are involved who were there that night. There's two central questions about it. First, there's the event, the sexual assault that happened, and whether there was a sexual assault. That's up to the jury now to decide. But there's also the issues of how the commanders acted that night, how they looped in their other people in the chain of command, how that worked. So once this trial is over, there's also going to be a civil lawsuit because of the events of that night. So there's still going to be fallout no matter what the jury decides today or in the next several days or so about that particular case. So there's lots, I think, still kind of up in the air about this.
Well, as Hannah Cree of AZPM reported, she's been doing a great job covering the trial. That civil part of it was mentioned by the defense attorney saying, maybe she can get $900,000 out of this as opposed to actually. Does that sort of thing, I can't ask you to speak for a jury, but as someone who's covered trials, do jurors think about some of the language that a defense attorney would use in that case? So, it really doesn't matter how you do on this because there's a civil part of this too.
Well, one thing is that, the judges are always very careful in saying you need to judge the things that was shown in this trial, the evidence that was shown in this trial, and really specific to the charges that were in trial and not worry about these outside things. And jurors have specific instructions about that. So there's always kind of a tendency to narrow those outside influences to that. Certainly, of course, the defense is going to bring that up because they're trying to protect their client. But for juries, they're going to decide on the evidence that was presented to them. And if they're convinced that that sexual assault happened, that Ricky is guilty, then that's the verdict they may come back with.
Yeah. John, let's have you weigh in on this. But before, let's give people sort of a disclaimer because you haven't been on in a while, but there was a certain situation with the sheriff's office and your publication directly affecting you.
Yeah, that's right. So this is something that is potentially being investigated by a couple different agencies. It's not exactly my role that is being investigated, but I did get wrapped in because there was a number of accusations made that we were colluding with Nanos's former challenger for the office of the sheriff. And just to be super clear, I know my colleague and editor was on earlier, but what it boils down to is that we reimbursed an impecunious inmate who had been in communication with me for about a year, sending me multiple letters and making many phone calls. And people who are locked into the Pima County Jail and most jails throughout the country have a very difficult time communicating with anyone outside. It is expensive and it is hard to do. So it is common practice and it is something that is absolutely within the ethical standards of journalism to reimburse people for those communications. And that's what we did. And looking at the facts of the case, anyone with sound mind would recognize that. So just want to be super clear on that. And about this trial, I think that there's another aspect to consider here, and that is something like maybe the court of public opinion as well. Nanos, as we were just discussing, has been embroiled in a series of controversies, and this case is not only about the facts of the alleged sexual assault or what's going to happen in the civil lawsuit, but also the handling of it, and that I think is going to be litigated amongst the Board of Supervisors and sort of the greater community. There's been a number of things that have raised some red flags. The decision that seems to have been a personal one to investigate in-house that the sheriff's department is investigating its own employees. And then there was some contact, which I think both sides of the trial said was unusual between Nanos and the victim. And so, I think that this is something that's going to be talked about beyond the decision that comes from the jury in the next couple of days.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, that's why I think the civil lawsuit is so important, because the jury trial is going to be narrowed on the acts of that night. That's the specific charges. Yeah. But talking about the bigger issues is where the civil lawsuit's really going to land.
Yeah. And Katya, as I mentioned, your colleague Hannah Cree has been covering this extensively. Anything in particular stand out to you as far as what you've read of her coverage, other than what Paul and John have already said? Something that really stands out about this trial to you?
I think the fact that it, with regard to the investigation, it's raised a few problems. One being that the sheriff's department decided to go ahead and pursue and investigate it itself internally. I think it was interesting that it caught the attention of the Attorney General's office back in September, so that we could see some follow-up with that.
Yeah. Sarah, any thoughts on this specifically?
Yeah, I mean, kind of what Katya said. This has been being talked about for a while now, and how it was handled, and there was some, not following policy, and so we'll see what happens in the future.
Paul, let's dig in briefly on the potential politics of this. The relationship between Sheriff Nanos and the supervisors has not been great anyway for the last number of months. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying maybe some of them wouldn't have been upset if Heather Lappin had won. So going forward, does the outcome of this trial even affect that relationship as well? Will they say, well, this shows again that we're questioning your management style, and more than that, obviously? I
mean, I think the jury trial itself will affect it either way. Because it says the specific charges of sexual assault for one of the deputies. Now, of course, that deputy immediately got fired once this was pursued. But yeah, I mean, I think the question about the investigation, I mean, the critical incident team was created in some ways to deal with shootings, to deal with other kinds of incidents, and for them to not call in the CIT and have, say, TBD doing the investigation instead to sort of deconflict themselves was let me say it this way, it's an interesting choice. And certainly there's the relationship between Nanos and the Board of Supervisors has been really strained for really since last September. And these last couple months, it seems to be getting worse. So yeah, there's a really tough relationship. One thing that's tough is the Board of Supervisors have limited power against the sheriff. They really only have a budgetary power. And so even discussing about doing a censoring him was really something that they probably can't do, that really doesn't have any teeth to it. And then they can affect his budget, but then of course that's bad for the county because he's the one who controls the jail and the major law enforcement arm of the county. So
yeah, John, that dynamic is really difficult.
Yeah, it is. As Katya mentioned, the Attorney General looked into it at the request of the Pima County Board of Supervisors. Mm-hmm. So they didn't come on their own. They were specifically requested by the county. And there's one other, maybe two other, I think, potential follow-ups here. Remember, again, we're almost 2 years out of this incident. This has been dragging on for a long time, and I think it's far from over. One of them is the internal affairs investigation, which Nanos has signaled a number of times that will only happen after the criminal case is finished. So I guess that might be starting soon. How long is that going to take? What is the outcome or fallout potentially of that? And then also the AG may be investigating again, or maybe looking into the potential 4 rule violations that they identified back in September that could have been violated, may have been violated by the department.
Next item to talk about, also Nanos related, friend of the program, Tim Steller, not here to talk about his own column, but Sarah, let me get a couple comments from you on this. In Tim's column, he mentioned that having Nanos win, even though I don't think anyone would characterize Lappin as being a fan of MAGA, but having Nanos there could somehow keep at bay some of the ideas that the Trump administration has related to immigration, border security. What did you think of that column when you read it?
Yeah, he made a good point in saying that Nanos has repeatedly said that he would help his federal partners as much as he always has done, but he's not going to take that on as other sheriffs in other places like Cochise County Sheriff has done. So it'll be interesting to see how that relationship goes on in the future.
Yeah, I think there is a big difference between deciding not to actively participate with any federal enforcement and blocking any federal enforcement, because the feds have a lot of room to maneuver in Pima County or anywhere they want. And the current border czar, Tom Homan, he has threatened recently the mayor of Chicago for saying that he was going to obstruct any sort of federal enforcement. And he has also been very clear repeatedly saying that if anyone tries to do anything to stop us, we will move in and we will get it done anyway. So I think that, maybe it's a little bit of posturing and potentially it is helpful. And maybe that rhetoric is actually helpful as well to kind of calm some nerves and things like that. But in the end, I don't know how it actually manifests in a different way than if you were participating.
Yeah. Katya, do you think in some ways Tucson, Pima County feel like on an island to some extent? Because even Jim Ninsel had a report he wrote a couple of weeks ago saying, oh, well, this is contrary to how a lot of the country went. Do you think that could create some difficulty or could create some sort of help for some citizens, maybe some who are non-citizens, being in Tucson and Pima County as opposed to some other area of Arizona?
Yeah, I don't know if I would characterize Tucson or Pima County as being on an island per se, because when sheriffs went to go see the border czar, Nanos, as well as the Santa Cruz County Sheriff, opted not to attend. So I think with regard to assisting whatever Trump's plans are, which we still don't know yet, it's kind of a game of politics, we'll wait and see sort of thing. But Nanos did say that, I'm keeping my deputies here on the street and I'm not sending them out. So.
And John, to your point, it's interesting. We're not on January 20th yet, and yet you already called Tom Homan the border czar, which I mean, he technically isn't, but it's odd because he is not even taking over at the earliest for 6 weeks, 5 weeks?
Yeah, but I think, the community here, and I'm sure all of us have been talking to people who are ready. They are preparing themselves. They are trying to strategize about how to protect their neighbors or themselves or their families. And we will see what happens. I think one other thing that is important to keep in mind is that there are a lot of ways that the feds could actually be affecting our community, our county, and it's not dependent on enforcement or local law enforcement at all. Rodney Scott is being named as the next head of Border Patrol. He was presiding over Border Patrol when they released the BORTAC, the tactical teams, to police protesters in Portland. There's a lot on the table right now that we don't know, and I think a lot of people are either bracing themselves or trying to think about how to proceed as maybe a crackdown is going to come.
Yeah, Paul, you're someone who's covered the border a lot. Final thoughts on this, but put it in a shell for us.
Well, really, I mean, you have to go back to how SB 1070 was passed here and how local police here reacted to that as a structure that was put in place, which is really that when they pull somebody over, there's this sense of, well, you need to immediately ask for their identification. And local police don't want to do that. Local police, of course, will ask for your driver's license. If you have a driver's license, then, of course, that may walk through an investigation where you say, okay, you're from Mexico, you're not here, you don't have a visa, we need to call Border Patrol, we need to call ICE. But they won't wait for those agencies to come for very long. And each of the, TPD, the Sheriff's Department have all said, look, we'll do this stop. If we need to, we'll hold this person, but we're not going to hold them all day. You need to come get them. We have other things to do. And our probable cause gives us some limits to that. So I think for the Sheriff's Department, that's still going to weigh in. Nanos and I talked about this, and one of the things he said is, if we get to the point where we realize somebody's in the country without authorization, we're still not really authorized to hold them. At some point, we're going to call the federal officials to come get them. But if they don't show up, we're going to release them.
But briefly on this, though, you mentioned 1070, which, of course, is the Spectre, but Arizona voters just passed Prop 314, which is slightly different from 1070, but still pretty strong in this, as far as local law enforcement.
Yeah, and 314 has the same kind of problem, is that, local law enforcement really do not want to weigh in. They don't want to do immigration enforcement. They want to enforce local laws. They want to enforce traffic laws. They want to enforce those things. And they're really not in the position of holding people for a long time, and they don't want to be in that. One thing goes back to the jails, and Nanos, of course, has the jail. The jails have really been in this situation where they've been asked to hold people for long periods of time, especially by ICE. This is the detainer request things that people often talk about. And this is also how sanctuary cities start to affect it. Lots of places would release people and would not follow the detainers. But for these agencies, if you say, hey, there's somebody here, you need to, you need to come get them. If ICE doesn't show up, all the liability starts to fall to localities, and localities have been less willing to hold that liability for holding somebody for a day or 2 days or 3 days or a week because ICE or CBP doesn't want to show up.
Yeah. John, final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Prop 314, it's not going to go into effect immediately, and it may not go into effect at all, but given the makeup of the courts and given sort of the trajectory of politics in this country, it may go into effect. And then I think your question about the island maybe comes more into play here, is that the law enforcement, sheriff's departments in surrounding counties have celebrated this bill, have met with, future border czar Tom Homan, Russ Steeples of Pinal County was, posting on Instagram with him recently. So how much will Tucson, Pima County stand up if they are isolated like that? The mayor has signaled that they're not going to engage in enforcement. I think a lot of community members are hoping and banking on that, but to be determined still.
Okay, Sarah, not to give anybody whiplash, we're going to go from that to the environment. You had a story this week in the Arizona Republic about Tucson suing the federal government. I'm going to say PFAS. I'm going to stick with forever chemicals at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Give us what's at the core of this. This has been going on for a while, but why did Tucson have to file this suit?
It has. So they're saying that the Air Force is not doing enough to mitigate contamination, which has been continuing to increase in groundwater and drinking water. And they're saying the help that has been given, either financial and otherwise, is not continuing into the future enough. And so they want reimbursement for all the lab tests and treatment plants that they've been paying for, and more help into the future.
Now, is Tucson claiming at this point that it really hasn't affected drinking water, that it's still sort of healthy?
Well, they say that the way they treat the water exceeds federal standards, but just for peace of mind for people, they released the treated water into, at least through certain treatment plants, into the Santa Cruz River to help levels. But the water is clean to drink.
So when you talk about, I presume Tucson wants this to keep going and payments to continue, do they have a number on that in terms of once they feel like the Air Force has done its job? Well,
they said I think they allege, I want to say $71 million they've spent on it, but they didn't put a number on that specifically. So I guess we'll see what happens. But the Air Force has maintained that it has paid millions of dollars to the city since the 90s to help treat PFAS, and they're following the federal laws to clean up the water. So we'll see what happens.
Katya, you cover the environment for AZPM. So I'm curious, have you had a chance to talk with people on the ground about whether they do feel like, wait a second, I have a lot of questions about this water, even more than I did before. Can you give me some as far as on the ground, the reaction from folks?
Yeah, so many questions, so much going on with this situation.
Yeah.
First, kind of going back to the lawsuit, it's really interesting at the timing of this, especially considering a couple months ago, the Air Force got into compliance with the Environmental Protection Agency over a Safe Drinking Water Act order that was issued back in May. So there was lots of back and forth going on with there. The Air Force has claimed consistently that, we've done our part. We've met federal law in terms of our responsibility in terms of cleanup, that sort of thing. So I'm really curious about this lawsuit in particular. In terms of on the ground, yes. Just as a disclaimer, the drinking water that Tucson residents are drinking, it is clean. Tucson Water, the utility company, they've shut off those wells that were in question with contamination and other contaminants in addition to PFAS, such as TCE, 1,4-dioxane, that sort of thing. I think the biggest issue now in terms of climate change and drought is that Tucson Water, the utility company, they want to bring those wells back online, and that's going to cost money. So they're thinking ahead into the future with that.
The timing that you mentioned is interesting, though, because I do remember your story when the Air Force was talking about being in compliance. So what does this next step say to you? Obviously, Tucson's not satisfied with that. The EPA might have been, but Tucson wasn't?
Well, I mean, Tucson was a part of those deliberations with the federal government and the Air Force, so they were part of those negotiations. The Air Force did agree in being compliant that they would pay for, it's an interim settlement agreement. So that's, I think, the key with that kind of phrasing, but they did agree to pay for about 50% of past treatment and about 50% future treatment costs.
Yeah. Sarah, what else stood about your report?
But people are still concerned on the ground. There's health the south part of Tucson, there's health issues related to presumably related to water contamination. And even now with, housing projects, people are talking about they're worried about messing up the ground because more contaminants will be released. So this is just going to be an ongoing issue for a long time.
John, what stands out to you about this as someone who's, I'm not saying you're a community reporter, but you really dig in on some of these things.
I mean, I think that Tucson's sort of stance is based on some of the real trauma that people have suffered. And, I think of one of my former professors here at the University of Arizona who lost her husband to cancer that was related to this exact issue. And she wrote very movingly of it, Beth Alvarado. And it has affected the community, and it's affected the community in very specific ways, like the lower income parts of the community. And I think that is something that we have seen as a pattern throughout the country, and addressing those wrongs is something that Tucson seems up for.
It seems like there's a balancing act, and I'm thinking of the coal-fired power plant that affected the Navajo Nation. This is a little bit different, but Katya, again, as someone who covers the environment so much, what stands out to me is that there always seems to be this balancing act of employees and employers, and obviously Davis-Monthan is an important part of the culture, but also the employment level here in Tucson. And yet, if they're polluting the water, I mean, it just seems like a tough balancing act for people who are making these decisions.
Yeah, definitely. I think
because these serious health problems John's talking about, these are real.
Oh,
and
yeah,
yet,
definitely.
And yet, no, they're not going to be shutting down Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. So
I mean, this is a generational problem. I mean, I've interviewed, her name is Linda Robles, and so her story is quite harrowing in the fact that herself and I think her 7 to 8 children were affected by some sort of disease or cancer, which is alarming. And she's just one family. She's been an advocate for many years. With that being said, I think because of the groundwater contamination here that happened on the south side of Tucson specifically, affecting those communities, and it is a balancing act because it's these lower income communities that are disproportionately affected, right? So how are you going to what I'm trying to say is I think the biggest challenge is them feeling heard, and
they're voiceless in some ways.
The powers that be, taking action and taking responsibility and continuing to clean up for the costs of maintenance and treatment plants and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and both of you had very important stories on that this week. In our last few minutes, Paul, I'm going to have you take us down memory lane. Will there ever actually be commuter rail between Phoenix and Tucson? Because even Governor Hobbs is now, we're going to have more committees, we're going to study this, and maybe we'll get started in 2028 if we even do get started.
I think anyone who has ever really done the Tucson to Phoenix commute has
do that every Friday.
There you go. Has gone, man, I wish I could do this on a train.
Yes.
And it has been something that we've talked about for a long time, but it's never really gotten much headway. It's sort of striking to me because New Mexico built their own system, their commuter rail system, and they started in 2006. They were basically done in 2008. They spent about $400 million on it. It's something you can do. You can jump on a train in Santa Fe and you can get down to Albuquerque. New Mexico managed to knock this out pretty fast. And even you've gone places in California. I mean, there's the Pacific Rails. There's lots of places where people can kind of commute from San Diego to LA. You can take a really pretty train, has a really great view of the Pacific Ocean on one side the entire time. It's fantastic. And trying to get that done. It's always about the limitations, of course, of money. Part of it is, of course, money, but also infrastructure that really isn't there, and trying to build up that system and also get some political capital to actually really convince people that this is where we need to spend our money. Looking at New Mexico, I mean, of course, there were a lot of complaints that they built this commuter rail system, but they didn't take care of the roads and some of the outlying parts in New Mexico. So there's always going to be that tension in there.
I mean, another hurdle to get over are Arizona state lawmakers who are trying to pass bills that would block any construction of intercity train. I think Hoffman last year or earlier this year said it was relying on 100-year-old technology, which is a little hard to wrap your head around. But, I think we need to keep on pushing for it. There's so many steps to get through that I'll believe it when I'm sitting on the train. Until then, I don't know.
I agree.
Yeah.
I'll be excited when they actually like open a rail line and we can buy a ticket.
But this makes me want. Katya, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think another challenge would be the environment. I just have to add that in there because I think from the initial study back in 2016, that was like another big issue is where you're going to exactly place this and what federally designated critical habitat along the way, what kind of wildlife will be impacted by something like that.
That even comes to mind. We're just seeing lane expansions in some of these freeways.
I mean, they're trying to ram through I-11, another highway. I mean, you think that if they could figure out a way to do that, get around the environmental concerns, they could figure out a way to get around something that is environmentally much more friendly, which is commuter rail.
And Sarah, I know you're relatively new to Arizona, but how would that sound to you?
I would love that, especially with people visiting me and I don't want to go pick them up in Phoenix. They can come take the train down. I'll pick them up from the train station.
Last minute or so. John, you're good at talking about the politics of this. You mentioned the state legislature. I'm not really sure I understand why it does feel like these days, at least the last decade or so, that those on the right are not in favor of rail. Those on the left are willing to give it a try. What do you think that philosophy is not a bipartisan one?
I don't know. I think it's a lot of posturing, at least on the right. I mentioned Hoffman, Kern as well. I think was trying to pass a bill, any sort of infrastructure project that has a whiff of Marxist ideology or something like that, including bike lanes, anything that would limit air travel or do trains would be automatically denied in the legislature. I think that given the future of Arizona, the environmental future of Arizona, you have to start thinking outside of the box of just gas-guzzling cars.
Well, the climate change, pollution, all these things. One would think, especially in the desert areas like this would be even something more important to discuss. Okay, very, very quickly, up or down, will this ever actually happen? Not ever happen. Will happen in the next decade. Katya?
Hard to tell. I've been hearing about this for a while.
Okay. Paul?
Yes.
John?
It better happen.
I'm optimistic, yes.
Okay. Thank you all for being here. Sarah Lapidus, John Washington, Paul Ingram, Katya Mendoza. And thank you very much for watching. The next edition of The Press Room is coming up next week. I'm Steve Goldstein. Have a great rest of your day.